The heavy leather belt groaned under the weight. On the right hip rested a Colt single-action Army revolver, chambered in .45 long Colt. On the left, a Smith & Wesson registered Magnum, chambered in .357. Both were silver-plated. Both were intricately engraved. And both were finished with smooth, gleaming grips made of genuine elephant ivory. To look at them was to look at a relic from a bygone era, something a 19th-century cavalryman might have worn while chasing outlaws across the Dakota Plains. In the mechanized, mud-soaked, industrialized slaughterhouse of the Second World War, they seemed completely out of place. Absurd, even. A reporter once made the mistake of asking if the grips were pearl. The response was immediate, profane, and legendary. The owner snapped that only a pimp in a cheap New Orleans brothel would carry a pearl-handled pistol. These were ivory. They belonged to the commander of the United States Third Army. And just like the weapons themselves, the man who wore them was loud, offensive, relentlessly aggressive, and entirely unforgettable. If the story of the quiet, deliberate general carrying a standard infantry M1911 pistol is a story about a leader who wanted to be one of the men, then this is the dark, mirror image of that history. This is the story of a commander who deliberately separated himself from his men, who built an arrogant, theatrical persona, and who used his sidearms not just as weapons of self-defense, but as psychological instruments of war. It is a story about the terrifying burden of command. And if you find yourself fascinated by the hidden psychology behind the history, the real reasons why wars are won and lost by the flawed humans who fight them, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. We explore the gritty, unvarnished history that documentaries usually skip. Understanding the ivory-handled revolvers requires going backward, far beyond the hedgerows of Normandy or the deserts of North Africa. The obsession with personal combat began in the dust of Mexico in 1916. During the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa, a young cavalry lieutenant found himself in a sudden, violent firefight at a ranch house. Armed with a Colt Peacemaker, he didn't dive for cover. He stood in the open, firing and reloading under pressure, ultimately killing 2 of Villa's senior commanders. He strapped their bodies to the hood of his Dodge touring car and drove back to headquarters. That single, bloody afternoon taught the young officer a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Violence, when applied with absolute, shocking aggression, paralyzes the enemy. But more importantly, he realized that soldiers need a myth to follow. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, the nature of combat had changed completely. Cavalry charges had been replaced by armored divisions. Individual heroism was swallowed up by artillery barrages that could obliterate a grid square in seconds. Armies were composed of conscripts, farm boys, factory workers, and school teachers who had never held a rifle, let alone killed a man. They were terrified. They were cold. They were homesick. Something had to force these ordinary men to move forward into a wall of machine gun fire. Some generals, like the ones who traded in their .380s for standard .45Es, believed in quiet solidarity. They believed in leading by shared suffering. The man with the ivory revolvers believed in something entirely different. He believed in fear, awe, and an overwhelming, aggressive momentum. In early 1943, the American Army experienced its first major taste of combat against the German Wehrmacht in North Africa at the Kasserine Pass. It was a slaughter. American troops, poorly trained and badly led, were routed by Erwin Rommel's hardened Afrika Korps. Discipline collapsed. Men abandoned their equipment and ran. The situation was a catastrophe. When the new commander arrived to take over the shattered Second Corps, he didn't offer comfort. He arrived in a cloud of dust, standing upright in his command car. He wore polished riding boots. He carried a riding crop. An oversized, gleaming helmet sat perfectly angled on his head, and strapped to his waist, impossible to ignore, were the silver-plated, ivory-handled revolvers. Fines were immediately instituted for any soldier caught without his helmet, even in the rear areas. Neckties were made mandatory in the desert heat. Saluting was enforced with draconian strictness. The men hated him. They cursed his name. They called him Old Blood and Guts, muttering darkly that it was his guts and their blood. But a strange psychological shift began to happen. The intense, almost theatrical focus on discipline forced the terrified soldiers to stop worrying about the Germans and start worrying about their commanding officer. The revolvers were central to this theater. When he visited the front, he didn't try to blend in. He wanted the sun to catch the silver plating. He wanted every soldier in the trench to see that an American general was standing completely exposed to enemy fire, looking utterly fearless, daring the enemy to take a shot. If the general isn't afraid, the logic went, then I cannot be afraid. It was a performance. Beneath the gleaming helmet and the scowling face, the general was a deeply anxious man. He suffered from bouts of depression. He read history obsessively. He knew the horrifying mathematics of war better than anyone. He knew that thousands of the young men looking up at his polished guns were going to die violently. To cope with this unbearable reality, he constructed a character. The revolvers were the costume. The vulgar language was the script. He transformed himself into a god of war because he believed that was the only way to save American lives. A rapid, violently aggressive attack might cost 100 men today, but a slow, cautious advance would cost 1,000 men over a month. Speed was armor. Aggression was safety. And to maintain that aggression, the commander had to be more terrifying than the enemy. This philosophy produced spectacular results. During the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, the 7th Army tore across the island, covering ground at a speed that left the British and the Germans completely stunned. The theatrical general pushed his men to the point of absolute physical collapse. He demanded the impossible, and because they were terrified of failing him, they achieved it. But the mythology of the Ivory Revolvers had a catastrophic flaw. A man playing the role of a merciless warrior god cannot afford to show empathy. Empathy breaks the spell. In August of 1943, inside a sweltering field hospital in Sicily, the performance collided with reality. Walking among the wounded, the general encountered a soldier who had no visible physical injuries. The soldier was suffering from severe battle fatigue, what we now understand as PTSD. The young man was weeping, his nervous system completely shattered by the horrors of artillery fire. To the general, whose entire command philosophy relied on the absolute suppression of fear, this was not a medical condition. It was a contagion. It was cowardice that could spread through an army and destroy it. In a sudden rage, he slapped the soldier. He drew one of his famous pistols, waving it in the terrified man's face, screaming that he ought to shoot him right there. The incident nearly ended his career. The Supreme Command pulled him from duty. The public was outraged. The man who had built an invincible persona was suddenly benched, forced to watch the D-Day invasions from the sidelines, acting as a decoy in a phantom army to fool the Germans. The revolvers stayed holstered. The warrior was caged. Yet, history has a strange way of requiring the very monsters it tries to banish. By December 1944, the Allied advance in Europe had stalled. The winter was the coldest in memory, and out of the freezing fog of the Ardennes forest, the German army launched a massive, desperate surprise attack. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. American lines were shattered. The 101st Airborne Division was completely surrounded at the town of Bastogne, freezing, running out of ammunition, and facing annihilation. The Supreme Command panicked. The situation seemed impossible to salvage. During an emergency meeting, the Supreme Commander asked his generals how long it would take to pivot their forces to rescue Bastogne. Most asked for days, perhaps weeks, to organize the logistical nightmare of turning an entire army in the middle of a blizzard. The commander of the Third Army didn't hesitate. He said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. It was a logistical impossibility. You cannot disengage hundreds of thousands of men from combat, turn them 90 degrees, move them over icy roads in a snowstorm, and launch a coordinated counterattack in 2 days. It could not be done. But he had already given the order before he walked into the meeting. This was the masterpiece of the theatrical commander. This was the moment the ivory revolvers, the polished boots, and the screaming discipline of the past 2 years finally paid off. The Third Army didn't hesitate. They didn't question the order. They simply moved. Truck drivers drove for 40 hours straight through the freezing dark. Infantrymen marched until their boots froze to their feet. When the Third Army smashed into the flank of the German offensive, breaking the siege of Bastogne and turning the tide of the war's largest battle, it was not because they were better equipped. It was because they were driven by a terrifying, unstoppable force of will. The general rode the roads during the offensive, standing in his jeep in the freezing cold, the revolvers strapped to his waist. He directed traffic at chaotic intersections. He screamed at stragglers. He was a visible, unavoidable force of nature. To the men freezing in the snow, seeing that ridiculous, gleaming helmet and those ivory grips moving among them was a reminder. The old man is here, and he expects us to fight. After the war, the man who had turned himself into a living weapon found peace to be unbearable. A general built entirely for destruction has no place in a world that is trying to rebuild. He made political blunders. He insulted allies. The theatrical persona that had saved hundreds of thousands of lives in combat was now a massive liability in peacetime. In December 1945, just months after the war ended, he was paralyzed in a low-speed car crash in Germany. He died a few weeks later. He was buried in an American military cemetery in Europe, facing his men, leading them one last time. Looking back at the 2 types of leaders, the contrast is breathtaking. One general chose the heavy, standard issue M1911 because he wanted to be exactly like the men who bled in the mud. He offered quiet competence and shared sacrifice. His legacy is one of steady, undeniable trust. The other general carried silver-plated, ivory-handled revolvers that belonged in a museum. He cursed, he strutted, and he demanded the impossible. He did not want to be like his men. He wanted his men to believe he was invincible, so that they might become invincible too. Both approaches won the war. Both required a devastating personal toll. Weapons are never just metal and wood. In the hands of history's most pivotal figures, they are physical manifestations of a philosophy. A standard .45 says, "I am with you." An ivory-handled .45 says, "Follow me or get out of my way." The history of conflict is rarely simple, and the men who wage it are never perfect. They are complex, deeply flawed, and heavily burdened. If you want to keep exploring the real, untamed stories of the past, the decisions made in the darkest moments of the 20th century, make sure you hit subscribe and leave a like on this video. It tells the algorithm that real history matters. Drop a comment below. Which leadership style would you rather follow into combat? The quiet solidarity of the standard infantryman, or the terrifying momentum of the Ivory Revolvers? The debate is older than the weapons themselves. Stay tuned, because the history is far from over.